Hey everyone, welcome back. It's Bob again, or Dogger Bones, and we have another installment of the Improving an MTG video reviews. So once again, we have another match from Mike, who we did last video. He's still playing the same Orzhov Shadow list. It was the same session. And once again, the deck guide will be in the description below. So, we'll just hop right into it. Mike is on the play this game. So, not the greatest hand in the world. 4 black lands, functionally. 2 white cards and a Thoughtseize. Obviously, you want to analyze every hand, see its potential. What's your draw potential? So, what are the odds you're going to find the card that makes your hand? But when you're considering that, you also have to consider how good your hand is when it makes it, when it gets the card it needs. So, Mike would need specifically a white lands, which there's about how many in the deck? I'm trying to think off the top of my head. I think it's 14 sources, roughly. So 53 cards, 14 sources. It's give or take 25% chance, right? No, give or take. I think I'm only off by a little bit. Mike correctly decides to mulligan that, though, because only 25% to hit the land next turn. And if you don't, you can't do anything. So, didn't really make any sense to keep. So, now Mike has a hand of a few threats, some lands, and an Infernal Grasp. I think this is a pretty clear keep. He has both colors. He has stuff to do. The question is, though... Oh, sorry. I actually forgot to mention one quick part. So with this hand, I actually asked Mike if he had a white land, would he have kept? He was hemming and hawing. He said on the blind, I think I would, which I agree with. This hand is not spectacular if, say, one of those Agadeem's Awakenings was just like a Galdus Shrine. But it's acceptable, because against like a good majority of decks, Esper Sentinel to Luminarch Aspirant is a pretty strong curve, and you have Thoughtseize to follow it up. You have a good amount of lands, so you can recur Lurrus pretty safely if they decide to go after your board. So it's a pretty reasonable hand if they do happen to have, if it does happen to have the white. But we mulligan, we get this hand, as we said, pretty easy keep, but what do you put back? So that's definitely the harder question. So I think it was a pretty clear that you have to decide between a land and a threat. If you're going to put away a land, it's going to be the Ifnir. So it depends. Do we put away a threat? Mike decides to put away an Adanto Vanguard, which I believe is correct. Adanto Vanguard is really good at sticking around. So actually, let's talk about that a little bit, because it seems like a very minor thing, but with very large implications. So, between a land and a threat, Adanto Vanguard is really good in this metagame, for the most part, depending on the decks you face, but it's at its best against control decks. As you can see, the opponent's a Lurrus deck. So what that can mean is that the opponent is most likely, it could be Black-Green Squirrel, it could be Auras, it could be Arcanist, or it could be a Brew. Those are the most likely for, Brew obviously is not really a likely, it doesn't pinpoint what exactly they could be, but I would say Black-Green Squirrel is the most likely, then Auras, then Arcanist, then the least likely would be something else that also plays Lurrus. We're also playing something else that plays Lurrus, so can't, I'm not judging, but so you have to analyze at this point how valuable is the Adanto Vanguard then. So in the two most common matchups where they would have Lurrus, Adanto is one of your worst creatures realistically. It's very bad against Squirrel because they make so many 1/1 blockers in Cauldron Familiar, or just make a big Squirrel. And Nora's, it just does like nothing pretty much. So we have to consider, is the Adanto Vanguard better than the third land? Which, if you're going purely by a statistical standpoint, no, it's clearly not. You want to be able to cast your spells as you draw them. You want to be able to double spell. Unless the Adanto Vanguard is fantastic in the matchup, which it kind of is in Arcanist. There are times it's not even if they have an early young Pyromancer and we don't have removal for it. We did, so it doesn't exactly apply. But if we knew for sure that was control, then I could see putting away a land. We'd probably put away the Infernal Grasp in reality, but Adanto Vanguard is just so good there that having two is just so, is just going to pressure them so quickly. And even if they have an answer for one of them, they probably won't have an answer for a second, so on and so forth. But based on the odds, Mike correctly puts away the Adanto Vanguard. So immediately after I praise him, a little chastise, Mike played the wrong land for a turn. So he correctly analyzed that I want to take damage. I have the Death Shadow in hand, right? That's good. But in this deck, you actually want to be playing your deserts first. Why? Your deserts, you cannot guarantee the damage. That's the wrong way of phrasing it. You can only get one life out of them per turn, right? The earlier you play them, the more life you're going to be able to take off yourself, which is actively good with Shadow. Godless Shrine is always going to be the same too. So if you want to take more life off yourself, which Mike wants to at this point, because we just want to get a big Shadow out as soon as possible, especially not knowing what they are, but if it's Squirrel or Auras, we're just going to want a big creature, ideally. You want to take as much off as you can. So if you start with the Ifnir, you can take a damage off, and then next turn take another damage off. But you might be wondering, well, if you go Ifnir to Godless Shrine or Godless Shrine into Ifnir, take a point, isn't that the same exact thing? It is. It is the same exact thing. However, if you draw a Concealed Courtyard next turn, there's a very good chance you just want to play the Courtyard before it might accidentally come to play tapped. And then you just lost 2 potential life if you go from the Ifnir line to the Godless Shrine line. You would have been at a lower life total if you did it the other way, because you lose on the next turn. If you decide to shotgun the Godless Shrine, you lose 1 total point. Or I guess if you play the Ifnir out, you lose 1 total point, because you'd ping yourself twice and ping yourself a third time, play Godless Shrine. You'd be at 15 versus paying the 2 life, going Concealed Courtyard. Actually, no, it's a 2 life differential. So it seems silly to harp over such a small thing, especially when you have to draw one specific card to make that bad. But it's those little advantages that can add up. So the opponent is abs and scales instead. Not what we were expecting, but hey, it's going to happen, right? So Mike then correctly plays the Ifnir, plays the Adanto. So bit of a sigh of relief. To be honest, the other Lurrus matchups for the most part are not great for Shadow. But like a random creature deck, we'll take random creature decks every day of the week. That's what our deck's designed to be. So they just play out a second Hardened Scales. So we draw Thoughtseize for turn. So now Mike has to decide what he wants to do. Obviously, we're going to attack. There's no question the opponent's completely tapped out. So it is our game to play for this turn. But what do? We have a few options. So I'll just pause quickly. Realistically, we have two 2s, 2 1s. So you can either play 2 and a 1. You could hypothetically just play 1-2. Kind of inefficient because you can just cast another 1-drop, so you probably should. Or we could play 2 1-drops. So we have a few lines there. And any of them, in abstraction can be reasonable. But let's see what Mike decides to do. And then we'll talk about it. Some water first while we wait. All right, so Mike decides to play Thoughtseize, which I think at the moment was a very big misplay. And I'll explain why. So Mike was poised. Let's rewind a little bit so you could see the board state. Yeah, it's good enough. Mike was poised to have a pretty insane next few turns. So what he could have done, attack with a Adanto Vanguard, put them to 17, pay 4 life with a Adanto Vanguard, put himself to 13, play Ifnir Deadlands, tap just 1 desert, so put himself to 12, play a 1/1 Death Shadow. Because what that allows, so the opponent played double Hardened Scales, so the most likely scenario next turn is just they're going to play a big creature. So what Mike could have done then is just go off on them. They play a big creature, because they have double Hardened Scales. They're likely to play a big creature, or maybe even like a small creature, big creature, but whatever, the combination. You get to Infernal Grasp on the opponent's end step, untap, swing in, Thoughtseize them, take their best play, and then Infernal Grasp their presumable second best play. Lights out. Game is over. Like, how are they realistically beating that sequence of events, right? They just probably aren't. If you go for the Thoughtseize line, the problem here is that, all right, you Thoughtseize, you take something. Are you going to hold open Infernal Grasp? No, probably not. You want to play the Shadow still, so you're not holding open Infernal Grasp. So you take their best line, you play the Shadow, they play a big creature, then you are forced to Infernal Grasp on your turn so you can guarantee some damage, or maybe you don't, you wait, who knows, right? Depends on what they play. Attack with both, and then if they deploy like 2 threats out the next turn and you didn't draw a land, you're probably just forced to just Infernal Grasp one of them. Maybe you can only attack with one. You're probably at a pretty low life total at this point too. So if they have a removal spell, you might just die. So I think that the Thoughtseize line opened Mike up to a lot of bad things happening to him. I think the only way he really could have lost at this point was by Thoughtseizing into Shadow. Because if they just like draw out of it, in a sense, or Mike gets a little too risky with attacks and gets punished by like a removal spell he's not expecting, that's a way to lose versus my line, where you deploy your Shadow, get a removal spell, Thoughtseize their best play, Grasp their next best play. You could argue that, well, what if they just kill the Shadow on their turn? They could. But that even if they did do that, then you still have pretty much the same exact line. You could still Thoughtseize hold open Grasp, which is almost certainly still going to be a great line, just slows the game down a bit. Or you could even just get Lurrus at that point. And then if you draw lands, we already have 3. We just go Lurrus, Death Shadow, and they're just stuck in the same spot. So it seems kind of unlikely that they would want to play a removal spell at that point. They'd probably want to build to the board. But it's really funny what actually happens here. Mike Thoughtseizes and finds this hand with an Ochre Jelly in it. So with double Hardened Scales and the third land, what actually would have happened is that the opponent would have paid 3 mana for an Ochre Jelly, so it would have supposed to come in as a 2/2. It would come in as a 4/4. And it has the ability to split that when it dies, if it had 2 or more counters, which it would as 4, it creates a token with half the amount of counters at the beginning of the next end step. So half of 4 is 2, of course, but Hardened Scales grants 2 additional counters. So what that would actually mean is that the opponent would functionally have an infinite blocker. If it keeps dying and just keeps making 4/4s, it's at the next end step at least. So we can circumvent that a bit with removal. But that actually would have been really, really bad for us. It'd be very hard to beat that. Not impossible. But what we'd have to do is that we'd have to work the game to a point where we have like double, triple removal spell where you can kill the Ochre Jelly, kill something else, swing in for lethal or something. Because otherwise, we're just not going to be able to get through it. Because if we don't kill the Jelly and try to attack for lethal, they just chump. If we kill the Jelly, go for lethal, and they just chump, well, then we still have the Jelly to worry about the next turn. So I'm not saying we would have lost if we didn't Thoughtseize, but it actually would have been a much tougher game. So funny enough, Ochre Jelly is the one card that makes Mike's line correct, at least contextually, right? So now it begs the question, was the Thoughtseize right all along? Well, there's one argument where no, because statistically it was not the correct line, even if it worked out, that doesn't make it the correct line, which is a school of thought that I generally agree with. Just because something works out doesn't mean it was the correct line. Sure, in the game state itself, it ended up being the better play, but it wasn't the correct line, which I think is two separate things. However, something we have to consider is that if we knew the entire deck list and that they played 4 Ochre Jelly, is the Thoughtseize now correct? Well, when I was talking about the lines before, where if you just go Shadow, hold up Infernal Grasp, so on and so forth, that's great. If you go for the Thoughtseize into Death Shadow, they could just start playing out creatures, and that's not as good. However, that's still probably a winning line regardless. Even if you have to time your Infernal Grasps awkwardly, it seems not very likely they're going to get out of that spot, right? Because say that you Thoughtseize, you take their removal spell per se, and they only have like one creature they can cast next turn. They cast their one creature. Then you could just go to a really low life total. Probably, if I'm doing my math correctly, you'd be at 12. So you can go to like even 1, I believe. 2 to 1 and attack the opponent for 14 to 15 with Death Shadow and Adanto. And now they're at 5, and shocking is a big risk to them. Well, I guess you can't go that low because you want to still have enough life for the second Infernal Grasp. So say you go to 3. You go to 3, you attack them for the 13, they're at 7. Now they have to play 2 creatures or die, right? So that's still a really good line, of course. It's slightly suboptimal on the basis of what I said before. But if we know specifically that they're playing Ochre Jelly, Thoughtseizing might have actually been correct. But we both didn't know that the opponent had Ochre Jelly. It wasn't a consideration. So even now, I'm actually very unsure what the correct line was. Like the technically correct line. I think contextually taking the jelly saved us. And maybe if we knew that they played 4 Ochre Jelly and we analyzed that's probably the most likely way we'd lose this matchup is double Hardened Scales into Jelly, maybe we should have Thoughtseize then. Who knows, right? That's really hard to say. So the opponent just plays a Luminarch Aspirant. So pretty much the game is going as we expected otherwise. Mike decides to take a point, draws another hand disruption spell, and I think we can both see that the writing is on the wall now. Because it's pretty easy. You just Inquisition, take their best play, you kill the Luminarch, then next turn you Infernal Grasp again. They didn't even draw something to play. So they have no outs anymore, pretty much. So Mike can take the damage with impunity, grasp, attack for, what would that be, 11? And that's pretty much it. Yeah, they just scooped. They knew they were dead. Which they technically weren't dead yet, but they're pretty much dead. So, sideboarding, Mike treated this as like a, just a random creature matchup, pretty much. So, wanted the portable holes. It's pretty much all he's taken so far. Hushbringer doesn't seem great. It does stop a few things, like Ochre Jelly specifically. But I don't believe it stops anything else that we saw. So even just stopping the Ochre Jelly, considering we're just talking up how bad it would have been if it resolved, maybe we should have considered actually bringing the Hushbringers in. That's pretty hard to say, honestly. Also, a pretty big consideration to board in the Containment Priest. We didn't see Collected Company, but they could be playing Collected Company. But they're also playing so many X spells that, like, how good could Collected Company be? So it's hard to say. I know Mike is deciding what to take out. I believe he takes out the Selfless Saviors, which seems reasonable, and Anadanto. You could argue that they could be playing black removal. They might be playing black removal. They might be playing white removal. We weren't sure at this point. So it's really hard to make a solid decision. That's what he ends up doing. Looking back, we probably should have taken out more Adantos. Adanto tends to be pretty bad in the creature matchups, where Selfless Saviors still can be good even in combat. And if they decide to play black removal spells instead of like white exile, then Selfless Savior would definitely have significantly more value there. So I think that was a mistake on both of our parts. Neither of us picked up on that. And furthermore, we probably should have been playing Hushbringer over Adanto Vanguard in case they were playing more ETB creatures, or if nothing else, just to stop Ochre Jelly. Because Adanto is just, pretty horrendous. Except if you're triggering Shadow specifically, then it's excellent. Even in the creature matchups. But that's still scary because if you go too low, you can just get like raced and punked out with just a removal spell on a bigger board. So, hard to say there. A lot of decisions go into every single game that, you got to really be cognizant of. You don't want to agonize over every single decision, but it's good to be aware of it. So we have this hand. Lands and just creatures. Generally, we want to have lands, creatures, and a piece of interaction or two. But Mike only has this. It's a little tenuous because 2 of the creatures are reliant. Caps lock again. Unbelievable. 2 of the creatures are reliant on the opponent losing life, but Knight of the Ebon Legion is really good at forcing through damage. So I figured it was pretty safe to keep this hand, and he agreed. It's a little risky if they go like creature, and then we have to like pump on 3 to finally get some damage off on them. But it actually all worked out because They decided to just go turn 1 Thoughtseize. We drew a Thoughtseize for turn, so we just threw it out there, which seemed very reasonable. Now, here's a really, really interesting Thoughtseize. So, at this point, we're both at 16. Both these Scourges are 4/4s. They're very threatening at this point. And this matchup, presumably, is all about big creatures smashing into each other. So we're prioritizing the Scourges very highly. And they show us 3 very reasonable choices. Even 4, actually, if you want to argue. Mythos and Nethroi kills one of our Scourges. They don't have the 3rd lands for it yet, but we could probably assume within 2 to 3 turns they're going to find it. So, do we take it to prevent them from killing our Scourges? Maybe. Conclave Mentor, a token, not a token, a +1/+1 counter doubler. Scary. Definitely worth considering. Luminarch Aspirant makes +1/+1 counters. Also scary. Ranger class makes a body and also can grind. Technically scary, I guess, in theory. So, based on those, I think we could safely assume that Ranger class is not the pick. Mythos is definitely a bit scary as well. However, Mike and I both agreed that, well, if they're spending their entire turn Mythosing, we could probably spend our entire turn grabbing Lurrus, and we could probably find the time to play Lurrus and play Scourge. We already have 4 lands, we only need a 5th. That's not that threatening to us. We're more worried about the creatures, because if we take the Mythos, then what can they do, right? They can go +1/+1 counter doubler into like Luminarch Aspirant or something. Then they could just outpace our Scourges anyway, and that's much worse for us than just removing one of the Scourges. So Mythos is gone. So it was between Conclave Mentor and Luminarch Aspirant. So we were debating this very heavily. I was on team take Conclave Mentor because I thought the +1/+1 counter doubler was more threatening, because they're not going to outpace our Scourges with just a Luminarch Aspirant. Mike wanted to take Luminarch Aspirant, arguing that, well, just +1/+1 counter doublers by themselves don't do anything either. Initially, I believed Mike was incorrect, because it's like, well, they are much more likely to draw a creature that can produce +1/+1 counters in some capacity rather than another doubler. But reevaluating, I think Mike was actually correct, because they would have to draw exactly what's the most threatening thing you could think of, right? Probably another Luminarch Aspirant. I guess it wouldn't be as scary if it was just like Luminarch Aspirant to Luminarch Aspirant and they didn't find a +1/+1 counter doubler. But my line could have really been punished if they just go Mentor and they go lands if they go Aspirant and they just find a Hardened Scales or something. So it could have worked out poorly. Even now, I'm not entirely sure which one was correct, but I think it's a very, very close call at that point. The opponent decides to go for a Ranger class to not expose their Conclave Mentor, which makes sense. Mike very easily goes for Scourge. I guess even now that I'm talking about it, I'm starting to lean back towards the Mentor side, but I don't know. It's so close. Tell me what you guys think in the comments. What do you think is the better take there? It's very tough. But again, what's not tough is going for the Scourge. Oh yes, I wanted to highlight this quickly. We'll let Mike draw the card. So the opponent shocks, plays Mentor, passes. So you may be thinking, all right, what 1 mana spell could they have? Mana Tithe? Yeah, technically. However, I think this was just a mistake. The opponent thought that they wanted to spend 3 mana that turn. They realized, I just want to play the Mentor, and shock themselves. How could you prevent that in the future? Because everybody does it. I do that all the time. You want to follow the principles of think, play, play, play. A lot of players, what they'll do is that they think for a bit, take an action, think for a bit, see the reaction from the opponent, take an action, think for a bit, take an action, end their turn. Or, something analogous to that. But it is not the most efficient way to play. What you really want to be doing is that if you really think through your entire turn, how it's going to go, and you try to plan for, a few variations as well. So, for example, for the attacks, you want to map out how the opponent can attack, and then figure out from that what you want to do in your second main phase. then you wouldn't get caught with sequencing errors. Sequencing errors are one of the biggest killers in Magic, even for extremely high level players. And losing 2 life here is extremely important in a matchup where you're racing, obviously. So they were at 14 before, and the Scourge can only have been a 6/6 because it's based on both the life totals, the highest of the two. But now, because they went even lower, Mike can shock with Gala Shrine, pay a life with Shavette Dunes, and now there's an 8/8. So now instead of the opponent having a 3-turn clock to potentially stabilize, now they technically only have 2. So you really want to be cognizant of what you're going to do that turn before making even a single action. You have to be careful because if you take too long, then you're slow playing, which doesn't matter so much on Arena because you have the rope to help remind you. But in real life, if you start taking more than a minute before making an action, you can get a slow play warning. So it is kind of difficult to know the balance, but practicing that now is going to yield a lot of dividends in the future. Let's continue. So Mike has a few lines again. Could go for the Adanto here. Could go for Scourge or could pick up Lurrus. So it is technically a decision. I don't think it's a particularly tough one. Knowing the opponent has Mythos in hand, they're likely to kill our Scourge next turn, or on their turn rather. So we probably just want to deploy another one so we just have the biggest threat on board. Because again, Danto's just really bad in this matchup. So it doesn't really make much sense to prioritize running that out over a creature that is much more threatening. If that was the Hushbringer that we probably should have brought in, that would be a different situation. I still think playing the Scourge out would be correct because you just want to pressure the opponent. They're already low. But it would at least be more of an interesting decision. So Mike attacks before paying the life with the desert, which seems fine. I think at this point, they're on a 2-turn clock no matter what. It seems extremely unlikely that they're just going to take it for this turn when they have 2 blockers. So I really like waiting. This I don't love as much. Probably should have just taken the point now and at least represent a push. Because you don't want to give the opponent information, sure. But you're giving them the information that you do not have Fatal Push in hand. Which is much more telling than I'm going to make both my guys 8/8s. Which I think the opponent could pretty easily infer at this point in the game. So that's a small error, which could have, reasonably big consequences. Now the opponent knows, okay, they don't have Fatal Push. I can play with a little bit more impunity. Realistically, it's probably not changing their lines, but you never know. It's not about what happens in the game because you leak that information. It's about what could happen in a game, right? If you get into the habit of doing that, you may do it at a time where it does really matter. Something very small to note for Death Shadow specifically. Mike set a stop at the opponent's end step, so he could decide whether or not to pay life. If you don't have a spell you can cast, or if you don't have any reason to get priority back, it'll actually just skip through and you won't even have the option to pay life, which has happened to me a few times when I forgot to set stops. So that was very savvy on Mike to do that. So now we have the decision between, do we want to play double creature or do we want to get Lurrus, play out Knight, which is a really tough decision actually. So you have really good arguments to both sides. If you play out double creature, you're threatening the opponent more. If you play out Knight and grab Lurrus, you're playing a little bit more conservatively. What is better here? You can think about that for a second, and I'll tell you my line as I drink some delicious water. Refreshing. So, I think the line here is to grab Lurrus and play Knight of the Ebon Legion. Why? So, at this point, we have to consider, how do we lose? Because we are pretty far ahead at this point. Their board is bad. They have fewer resources than us. We have a creature that's much larger than theirs. This is our game to lose. How could we lose? The only way that I can really foresee losing at this point is not that we get cheesed out in combat. That doesn't seem very likely considering how many creatures we have. But we get grinded out in some capacity. So if the opponent happens to have, I don't know, like triple removal spell in hand or something, it's not impossible that we might lose this game. So say we run out both creatures and they spend the turn killing Scourge and Knight. And now we're left with just a Danto. So we attack them for 8 or whatever. Yeah, we attack them for 8. Pass back, they kill both of our guys, attack back to 10. Or I guess I couldn't even attack back. And maybe we grab Lurrus and maybe they Inquisition it. And Portable Hole or a Danto or something. I know that's too many cards. It's like 4 cards when they don't have access to 3. But we have to think, how could we possibly lose this game, right? At this point, we're like 90-something% to win. But the only way I could like really see losing is if they somehow grind us out. And if we don't grab Lurrus now, they might find an opportunity to grab it later if we take it to hand later. So you want to grab it as early as possible because they very likely will not have the time to take Lurrus out of our hands and deploy something meaningful. Because even if they do happen to have like a Thoughtseize or Inquisition right now and a creature, does it really matter that much? You know, like we still have more threats to play, and if near Deadlands and Shafet Dunes to work with, so that's not so bad. And we're really limiting their options if we're pulling the Lurrus now, especially if say their hand is like double removal spell. But if we pull Lurrus now, play Knight of the Ebon Legion, now what do they do, right? Even if their hand is double removal spell, which would be the best possible for them at this juncture, they don't even have a great line because they kill both of our guys. They swing in for 2, I guess. Then we just play land, play Lurrus, play Scourge, pass. And they have to start top decking removal, or they're just dead. Because we get to play another Scourge next turn, and we have a Dantos still, and we still have a Knight of the Ebon Legion in the graveyard, and any other spell we can possibly find. Mike wanted to close out the game faster, so he opts, I believe, for the other line to go Knight Adanto Vanguard, which again, we're so far ahead it probably realistically does not matter, but I think does give the opponent some chance, a small semblance of a chance to win this game. I'm trying to rack my brain on situations where going for the double creature would be better. And in fairness, Mike very intelligently attacked first to help further dictate the decision. Because it's like, oh, well, now they have to play a creature or they just die, right? We could probably assume that their hand isn't just all lands. So they probably have a creature or removal spell, so they're probably just not just dead on this turn. But taking it, is also pretty interesting because, they're just so low now. So it's a fine line because they're so low. I still think it was incorrect, but again, they're so far ahead. It doesn't matter for the context of the game, but you always want to be considering how you can lose, especially when you're ahead. You got to think of how many games you stole from your opponent or your opponent stole from you based on slim odds, right? Very small thing. Mike took a point of damage there off the lands. Seemed really unnecessary at this point. The opponent decides to scoop. I guess they just didn't have anything. But taking the point at that juncture felt a little weird because, again, this is our game to lose. How do we possibly do that? And getting, randomly punked out in combat because we get Exact Seed or something is the way to do it. Our Scourge is already humongous. It's lethal no matter what. If we need to get lower, we can do it later. We have Triple Desert and a Danto. There's no real reason to do it now. Again, extremely small things. Didn't end up mattering, but a big issue that I see a lot with a lot of players is that these very small things happen a lot and they don't matter until they do. And then a lot of players are flabbergasted, like, oh, of course, the 1%er, right? The 1% of the time where that thing mattered, if they even recognize that it was a decision they made. But most of the time it's not. People just assume that they got unlucky and they died, right? But if you clean up these really, really small mistakes that seem inconsequential, that's going to really elevate your game. Because realistically, it's probably not just extremely minute mistakes you're making. it's probably more substantial mistakes, whether you recognize them or not, right? So having the ability and patience to really pick out these small edges that you can accrue, because every single percentage point matters in Magic, is really, really important. But anyway, that's the end of this video. I hope you guys enjoyed it, and I hope you guys learned something. It was a very interesting match, even though it ended kind of prematurely. The match itself was only, what, 13 minutes, but we were able to get like over half an hour of discussion. And please let me know if you like these styles of videos, if I'm going a little too slow, if I'm going too fast even. I think the breakdowns are helpful because this is how I analyze games. And realistically, the way people improve is by understanding every single facet of why someone makes a decision. So I'm hoping you find, even if it feels a little laborious at times, that this is good for your overall progression. But anyway, please give me any sort of feedback in the comments. I would really appreciate it. Thank you guys for watching, and have a great day.